How to start watercolor painting. Today I'm going to give you the answer to 7 of the most basic questions that I hear beginners ask time and time again when they first start learning to paint. Welcome back to my channel. If we have not met before, my name is Michelle, and on this channel you'll find all things watercolor as well as a little bit of mixed media and motivational stuff too. Please do consider subscribing. If you click the little bell icon, you can get notified every time I have a video for you. I make at least one free video a week here on YouTube on a Thursday with extra content on Saturdays for my Patreon subscribers. Now, I've been teaching watercolor painting out in the real world for over 20 years and also online. And of course, beginners have questions, and I see the same questions asked time and time again. And often they're just not addressed in most watercolor painting videos because those are just too advanced. So I'm talking about the really basic questions today. So it's all very well finding videos about techniques and painting and color mixing and all of those nice things. But if you're just at that stage where you're just sitting looking at your art materials and thinking, I don't even know how much water to mix in, I don't know how to apply the paint, then that's what I'm going to address in this video. So I've got 7 of the questions that I hear asked most often by beginners. I'm going to be starting from a point that doesn't assume that you have any prior knowledge. However, if you have been painting for a little while, I think you're still going to find a few things of value here in this video. So question number 1 is, how much water do I use? It seems like a really simple thing for people like me that have been painting for a long time, but if you're a beginner, you may actually just not have a clue how your paint is supposed to look and how much water you're supposed to mix with it. Now, it could be because you're a complete beginner to painting, or it could be because you've come in from another medium, like for instance acrylics or soft pastels, and you're going to find that watercolor paint is a little bit different. Now, this is something that is much easier for me to show you than to explain in words, so I'm going to point the camera downwards now and literally show you how much water to mix in with your paint. So here I've got a piece of paper with some painted samples on, and this is actually from the last YouTube video I made, which was all about basic brush strokes. Now don't worry, I'm going to link to that at the end of this video, so if you want to watch that one too, you can as well. It's a great video for beginners. But look at this sample here. This was called dry brush. Now this is what happens when you don't get enough water on your brush. The paint skips across the little dips. So let me do that one again for you so you can see how it works. So here, do you see my brush is fairly dry, the bristles are splayed out, it's not dripping, it's just very dry. So if I place it on the paper and start to paint, you can see the paint does not apply evenly. Now I've overdone that a lot, you know, it might not be quite as dry as that. But nevertheless, if you paint without enough water on your brush, you're going to get a dry brush effect. Now, can it be useful for things? Certainly it can. We're making fur here, but generally speaking, you don't want to have too little paint on your brush. Now, conversely, you don't want to have so much paint on your brush that you have no control over it. So if I just put a ton of paint on like this and just keep putting more water on it, as it dries, and I do have a bit of slope on my board here, it'll look to you on the camera like it's sloping downwards, it's actually sloping away from me. You can see that as it dries, it's not drying evenly. All the water is sinking to this end here because the board's on a bit of a slope, and even if the board was flat, I would still get some movement. The other thing that will happen, it will take time to see, but the other thing that will happen is that because there are puddles in certain areas, the paint will not dry evenly, and what that means is that areas will start to bleed and run into other areas, and you'll get all sorts of strange little lines appearing. Now again, using too much water as well as using not enough water are valid techniques, and they can be used. Once you start getting advanced with your watercolor painting, these things can be done. But initially, when you're just starting to learn to paint, I advise you to have enough paint on your brush, enough water on your brush that it flows. Remember, watercolor can dry up to 50% lighter, so if you have almost all water and no pigment, you're just going to get a really wishy-washy effect. So here I've got some paint on my brush, and let's spread that on. So here you can see I'm getting a nice even application. It's not drying the second it hits the paper. I don't have those scruffy edges because there's enough water to spread it along, and it's just sitting on my paper nicely. So this is the effect that you want to be going for when you first start that basic watercolor painting. You want to be looking at having a fair amount of pigment and water on your brush. If there's a little too much on your brush, just like this one here, you can just spread it out, can't you? And if you start to paint and there's not enough and you find that the paint is skipping over the edges, again, just add a little bit more water to your brush. So this is what you're looking for, strongly pigmented paint that flows nicely across your paper. So question number 2 is how to get rid of pencil lines after you have finished your painting. Now watercolour is pretty transparent, so you may be thinking perhaps you can rub out the pencil lines after you finish, and the truth is that yes, you can to some extent, but not always. It really depends on how much paint you've applied and on the opacity of that paint. So certain colours are more transparent and the pencil may rub out easier through those colours. Other colours like cadmium colours can be a little bit opaque, particularly the yellows, and you may find that your pencil lines get trapped in. So what to do? Well, the first thing is to make sure that you don't press too hard and that you apply as little pencil as possible before you start your painting. So you want to approach your sketch in a different way to how you would approach it if you were just doing a drawing for a drawing's sake. What you want to consider is that you are simply mapping out where to apply the paint, and your drawing does not have to be done all in one go. You can actually leave fine details until later on, and it may be better to do that. So initially just map out as little as you possibly can in order to get started. At any point when the paint is dry, you can do a little bit more drawing. Imagine you were doing a brick wall, for example. You could draw the brick wall itself, and then you could put on an underlayer of colour, and then perhaps when that's dry you could draw some more bricks on top to show you where to put the darker shapes. Now the advantage of this is that you can rub out that pencil more easily because it went on top of the dry paint, not underneath. Another thing that you can do is to use a reasonably soft pencil, or if you use a harder pencil, don't press too hard. If you press hard, what happens is you dent the paper, and then even if you do manage to rub out the line, you may find that the paint still sits in the dips. So a really light touch. Keep your work as clean as possible, do as little drawing as possible. You can always do more drawing as the painting progresses. At any time when the painting is dry, you can add a little bit more drawing. Another thing you can do is to rub out your pencil lines as you go through the painting. Now it's really important again that the paint is dry, otherwise it will smudge. But imagine you have a pencil line that delineates one area from another. Now you need that pencil line because you need to see where to paint up to. So imagine you then paint up to one side of the pencil line. Well, why not let the paint dry and take the pencil line out? You no longer need it. You can see how to paint up to the other side of it because you've got that first side in. So don't be trapping your pencil lines underneath paint if you don't need to. Put them in as little as possible and rub them out as you go through the painting. As soon as you no longer need them, just remember to let the paint dry first. So question number 3 is, why are there little bits in my paint? Why has it dried unevenly and there are lots of little speckles in it? Now there are 2 reasons for this. The most common reason is something called granulation, which I'll tell you about in a second, but another reason can be the paper. If you're using very cheap paper or if you've scrubbed at your paper a lot, it's possible that the paper can almost sort of start to lift and bead up. So have a look at your paper as well. But the most common reason I see beginners asking about this is because they don't understand what granulation is. So watercolour paints are not all the same, they vary hugely, and that's because a lot of them are still made from natural pigments. Now certain pigments are larger when they are ground into watercolour paints than others, and so you get these larger granules of pigment within the paint. You can actually see them. It's more about the pigment number itself rather than the manufacturer or the brand. For instance, ultramarine is a colour that always granulates heavily. It always looks uneven and grainy. Is this a bad thing? No, it isn't. In fact, granulation is one of the most beautiful things about watercolour painting. Now it can be difficult if you're trying to paint an area that's really smooth, like a sky. You might not want to use a pigment that granulates, you might want to choose a smoother colour. But you're going to be really hard pressed to avoid granulation completely in watercolour paints, and I suggest that you don't do that at all, because it really is one of the benefits and one of the most beautiful things about watercolour painting. I've had a few people lately say to me, actually, can you help me choose colours so that I just get transparent colours and completely avoid granulation? And what I would say to those people is, why are you actually painting in watercolours? And I'm not trying to be, snarky or sarcastic by saying that, but granulation is such an inherent part of watercolour painting that really, if you hate it, you'd be far better using something like acrylic inks or gouache or another medium altogether. Now, if you want to understand more about granulating paint, I have made a video all about it, and I'll link to that. It should appear up in the information cards above. It doesn't always on certain devices, so if you don't see it there, just have a look in the description of this video, and I'll list that for you so that you can find out more about granulating pigments. So the next common question that beginners have is, if you have tube paints like these, should you actually pour them out into a palette like this one and allow them to dry? So you can see from my own palette, I've done just that. Now, I was on a Facebook group today and somebody said, well, the manufacturers have told me not to do this. So I'm going to explain why manufacturers often say that you shouldn't do this and why most artists do it anyway. Now, let's look first of all at the benefits of doing this. So firstly, you will waste a lot less paint. You have easier access to your colours. If you just want a tiny little bit of yellow, you don't have to go to the fuss of sort of opening the tube up, maybe pouring out too much paint and wasting a whole load of paint. You can also keep your paints more clean this way, because if you, for instance, put a brush full of blue paint and you ram it into a whole puddle of yellow paint, then you've spoilt all that yellow paint. However, if the paint is dry, then the colour is only on the surface and you'll be able to clean that colour off. So many advantages to doing this with your tube paints. And of course, you still have the option, if you need really a lot of colour, you can still pick up that tube and pour out more colour so that you can make a big puddle of colour without sort of scrubbing and ruining your best brush by trying to get colour off of dried paint. So huge advantages to having both options available to you. So why do manufacturers tell you not to do this? Now, there's a slight difference in formulation between tube paints and what they call pan paints or blocks. In other words, the little square paints that you can buy that are already set. Now, there's a difference in formulation in that the binders that are used may have been formulated so that the paint stays wetter in tube paint, and so that there's a little bit less binder, or perhaps a different combination of ingredients in the binder in the paints that dry hard, so that they dry a little bit more easily and they don't crack, and they are optimized completely for using from dry. So what the manufacturers are saying is that we haven't formulated these tube paints to be dried, we have other paints that we formulate to be dried, and we would like you to use the paints exactly as we have planned them and not just go off on a tangent and do your own thing. Now, of course, I understand that, but the truth is that most paints work perfectly fine if you squeeze them out into wells. I've been doing it for years. I've particularly done it with Daniel Smith paints, I've done it with Talon's Rembrandt paints, I've done it with Winsor and Newton. Occasionally you might get some shrinkage, you might get some cracking. I haven't found any of those problems, but other people do. Some of the paints that have honey in the formulation, for instance, I've heard this of M-gram, it's very hard to get them to set. Any paints that you pour out like this are going to take several days before they set hard. But these are all minor things, and to be honest, I've found that it works really well. Now, the only disclaimer I would say here is that if you've got a paint that's really quite unusual, for example, I found this with Daniel Smith iridescent colours, paints that have high levels of shimmer in may actually set a bit too hard for you to re-wet. So if you've got something very unusual, it's worth having a little bit of an experiment and not pouring out half a tube and letting it set and then finding that it won't re-wet. But for most standard watercolours, this is going to work absolutely fine. Of course, manufacturers are going to tell you not to do it because they want you using the paint exactly as they formulated it. But the truth is, on a practical level, it works fine. And yes, it's a really good idea to put your paints out onto a palette so that they're easy to use, particularly when you only need a little bit. You'll find you get a lot less wastage by pouring your paints into a palette and allowing them to set. At this point, if you're getting some value from this video, can I please ask you to click the thumbs up, to click the like button. YouTube rewards channels with audience interaction, so if you like, share, subscribe, or even leave me a comment, YouTube will push this video out to more people and I can help more people learn to paint. Now, another really basic question that I hear people ask, but again, it's a very important one to know an answer to, and that's what sort of paper to paint on. Now, it's important that you use watercolour paper. Now, paper will buckle when you get it wet. That includes watercolour paper. Now, there are certain ways that you can prepare your paper in order to stop it from buckling. I'll put a link above to the video I have on stretching paper so that you can prepare your paper so that it won't buckle much when you paint on it, and it will dry completely flat. But you should be aware that the thicker the paper you paint on, the less it will buckle, and the more water you put on it, the more it will buckle. So to some extent it depends on your painting style as well when you're choosing your paper, but you must use watercolour paper, and indeed that's a rule for any wet medium. So if you're using watercolour pencils and you're going to put water with them, then again you should be using watercolour paper. Now, people often come to watercolour painting perhaps after being given gifts and given Christmas gifts, and bless people for buying us these things, but often the paper that you get is very poor quality in these sets. So what you want to avoid is watercolour paper that comes from what we would call stationers or drugstores. Those really cheap unbranded things, they can actually make them look quite posh. They have quite a pretty cover on and they can have quite expensive sounding names, but often they are just rubbish and you would be better off painting on toilet paper. So if you find you're not getting results, particularly if you find that the surface is beading up and little bits are appearing in your paint as you're painting, you may have very poor quality paper. So what I would advise when starting, because you're going to be making a lot of mistakes, so So I really don't go along with this idea of using paper that's £5 a sheet. It's pointless, you're just going to make loads of mistakes. Of course, the better the paper, the better your painting experience, but you don't need the absolute top of the range paper to get started with painting. What you need is just a good basic brand and a paper surface that's at least student quality. Now, other things that you must avoid using are sketching paper. In the UK, we call it cartridge paper. Somebody asked me the other day what that was, so I'm thinking possibly in the US you don't use the term cartridge paper to describe that smooth sketchbook paper, but that's what we call it here in the UK. Now, cartridge paper will buckle terribly and even possibly break when you put water on it, so that's an absolute no-no. You shouldn't be using sketch paper for watercolor painting. Another thing that's a little bit difficult is some of you are using the adult colouring books, which are great fun, and perhaps you're using watercolor pencil. Now, can you get away with putting a little bit of water on that? You'll have to experiment really, so it'll depend on the thickness of the paper. So you might get away with using, a tiny little bit of water with your watercolor pencils, but generally speaking on your adult colouring books, unless they were specifically made to have watercolor paint on them, you want to avoid putting paint on them and you want to stick to your watercolor paper. Now, watercolor paper comes in 3 surfaces. I won't bother going into all of them on this video because it'll just get too long, but you're just looking at using the standard surface, which is called cold pressed. It's sometimes called knot, N-O-T, and it's got a slight texture to it, and that's going to be your best paper to start with as a beginner. So you need that cold pressed knot medium surface watercolor paper. If it doesn't say on the pad what surface it is, it's bound to be that because it's the most common one. And you need to use a reasonable brand that's a reasonable thickness. If you don't know what the good brands are, I suggest you pop into either my Facebook group, which is very, very friendly. I'll put a link to it on the screen there, and I'll put an actual clickable link in the video description. But there's lots of other watercolor painting groups on Facebook as well, and the people in those groups will be more than happy to help you if you're not sure if you have a good brand of paper or you want some recommendations of paper to buy. Now, one question I often see is, should the paint be all kind of sticky and smeary and almost semi-transparent? So if you're using a tube like this, what might happen is you might open it and you might find that a load of sort of smeary gunk comes out. There just doesn't seem to be much pigment in it. Now, there's 2 reasons for this. The first reason could be that you just have really, really cheap paints and they've got a lot of binder in and not much pigment. So do check if the brand of paint you have is a good brand or at least a reasonable student's quality brand. And again, you can pop into any Facebook group or watercolor group or forum in order to ask those questions. But there is a reason why this sometimes happens even with good quality paint, and that's because it's been sat in storage for a little while and the binder has just gone down to one end. This can especially be a problem if you have ordered paint from abroad and it's travelled on an aeroplane and it's been under a little bit of pressure. What can happen is when you first take the lid off the tube, it can go everywhere and a load of the binder can come out first. It is of no harm whatsoever. All you have to do is make sure that when you open your tubes, you've got a little paint palette ready to catch them so you don't waste any paint. And if a load of smeary, sticky stuff comes out, just wipe it away before you do your painting. It doesn't mean the paints have gone off. There's nothing wrong with them. It's just binder. Now, although there's nothing wrong with that binder, if you have too much binder compared to pigment, it is going to make your paint smeary and a little bit hard to handle, and they may dry a little bit shiny too, which might not be the effect that you're going for. So if a load of binder pours out of your tube, do wipe it away, and if it's happening to all of your colours, do consider if you have perhaps very cheap paints, because the pigment is always the expensive bit, it's always the bit you're paying for, never mind the pretty packaging. If you're buying expensive paints, what you are paying for is pigment, and if you're buying cheap paints, you're going to get an awful lot of fillers, an awful lot of opacity, and an awful lot of binder. Now, we've talked about paper, let's talk about brushes, because that's another question people always have, is what brush should I use? Now, there is so much choice. In fact, there's too much choice. You can get rigger brushes, you can get filbert brushes, you can get rake brushes and Hague brushes. There's all sorts of brush names and it can get really, really super confusing. But when you're starting out, there's only really 2 brushes that you need, and that's a round brush and a flat brush. So a round brush looks like this. Although it's called round, I'm just trying to put it so that it's, let's put it against my wall there so that hopefully you can see it. Although it's called round, it actually has a point on it, and this is an old one, so when you buy that brush, it will have a better point than this one on. So this is your standard, if you imagine, like if you're drawing a picture of a paintbrush or a cartoon of a paintbrush, would look like this one, wouldn't it, an artist brush? That is the standard round brush that you need for watercolour painting, and when you buy it, it should have a good point on. I always prefer synthetic brushes because they have more spring, and also I don't like to kill animals just so that I can paint a picture. Now, the second type of brush you need is a flat brush. So this is a flat brush here, and you can see it's quite large, and this is great for spreading water onto your paper and also for painting large flat areas. So those are the only two brush shapes that you need. I would also, in addition to a brush sort of this kind of size, and there's no standard sizing between manufacturers of brushes, which is really helpful, isn't it? So this brush would be somewhere between, depending on manufacturer, it would be somewhere between a 12 and a 10. I would also add a smaller one to that. So I would add something like somewhere between a 4 and a 6 brush to that, so that you've got a large and small round brush, and then one large flat brush too. You can add more brushes as you go along. I'm going to do actually another video on brush shapes and brush types and go through all of the ones that you can potentially use for watercolor painting to give you a bit more choice. So don't forget to subscribe so you see that one, and we'll go through all of those other brush types as well, so that there may be a different type of brush that you find you need as you start getting more brushes, and they will get 90% of your painting done without any problems whatsoever. Now, I do have my own brush set available for beginners. It hasn't actually, at the time of making this video, which is in the very last couple of days of 2020, it hasn't actually been launched fully yet because we haven't got the branding done, but it is available. I've made it available to students of my online courses, and I'll make it available to you too. It's a really good value brush set. I'll put a link in the video description if you're interested in buying that one. It's made here in the UK, and it's a fully vegan brush set. And we'll be launching that brush set properly in the next few weeks when we've got the branding sorted out. But there's no actual difference. You still get the same set of brushes. You may not just get a pretty label on the box that comes on the outside. So I'll make that available to you if you're interested in that now. But whichever brand you decide to use, you want to be looking at those basic two brush shapes. And also you want to be looking that the brush you buy is fairly short in length. You see this handle is not very long. That's because it's a watercolour brush, not an oil painting brush. And oil painting brushes, because the paint is wet, you don't want to lean in the paint, they tend to be a lot longer. So if you've got a handle that's a lot longer, or if the bristles are white, these are not exact rules, but if the bristles are white, it's more likely to be an oil painting brush or an acrylic brush. Watercolour brushes tend to have these more brown coloured bristles, and that's the same whether they're real animal fur or synthetic like these ones. So do let me know in the comments if you found this video helpful and if the answers to these questions are going to help you move forward with your painting. Now, if you have other questions that aren't answered here, I do encourage you to pop along to my Facebook group. I'll put the link up on the screen, and again, the link to that is in the video description. I pop in there whenever I can myself, but it's also filled with some of the most helpful people on the internet, and we've everybody in there. We've really experienced painters who can help you with those advanced techniques, and we've also complete beginners who are just starting out. And everybody is kind, and everybody is encouraging, and everybody is helpful. So do pop along and join the Facebook group. And whilst you're looking at that video description, there are some free downloadable PDF guides that you can grab from me for no money whatsoever. And if you do need something a little bit more structured and you're looking for a paid course, I have my Complete Beginners Basic Watercolour Techniques course available to you as well. The link to that is also in the description. And if you found this video helpful and you would like to progress onto some really basic brushstrokes, I made a video a few weeks ago that goes through some really basic watercolor brushstrokes. So before you even start with actual subjects, you can just practice painting those simple brushstrokes. I think you're really going to enjoy watching it, and you can see that video right here.